Hey everyone, and welcome. We all think we know what a monster is, right? It's big, it's scary, it's something our heroes have to defeat. But what if I told you that monsters aren't born, they're made? Today, we're going to deconstruct some of the biggest giants in history to uncover the hidden story of how words, politics, and beliefs can build a monster right in front of our eyes.
All right, let's just dive right in with a puzzle from one of the most famous giant stories ever told. I mean, the story of David and Goliath seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? But there's this one tiny detail that honestly throws the whole thing into question. And that question is simply this: how tall was Goliath, really? We all have this image in our heads of an absolute behemoth, right? A towering figure of impossible size. But the oldest records tell a surprisingly different story. I mean, just look at the difference here. The later, more common texts we have put him at a staggering 9'9", almost 10 feet tall. But the earlier sources, things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, they have him at about 6'9". Now, don't get me wrong, that's still really tall, but it's the difference between a modern NBA player and a literal creature of myth. And you've got to understand, this isn't just some dusty scribal error. It's our first major clue. It shows us that stories can be shaped, they can be exaggerated, and they can be altered over time for a very specific reason. And that opens up a much, much bigger question. How else are monsters made? So to really get to the bottom of this, we have to look at the basic building blocks of any story, the words themselves. Because sometimes a monster isn't born on a battlefield. Sometimes it's born from the slow, subtle twisting of a single word's meaning. Okay, take the word asura from ancient Vedic texts in India. Originally, this wasn't a name for a demon. It was a term for a powerful divine spirit, basically a god. But as time went on and religious beliefs shifted, the asuras got, well, demoted. They eventually became the divine enemies of the newer, more popular gods, the devas. And hey, this wasn't a one-off thing. We see the exact same pattern in Norse mythology with the Jotun. You know, these beings weren't always the evil, monstrous giants we think of today. But as Christianity's influence started to spread across Scandinavia, the old gods and spirits, including the Jotun, got recast as demonic, evil adversaries. So you start to see this recipe, right? This journey a word takes to become a monster. It starts out as something powerful, maybe even divine. Then a cultural shift happens. A new religion, a new power structure comes along, and finally, that old word gets repurposed to describe the new enemy, the demon, the monster. But you know, some cultures, they didn't even wait for the meaning to change. They just named these beings for the exact feeling they wanted you to have. The Emim were literally called the terrors. The Zamzamim, a name that means buzzing or humming, were probably linked to that unsettling, creepy sound of whispering spirits. Their name was their monstrous purpose, right from the start.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because if a single word can be manipulated like that, just imagine what you can do with an entire story. Very, very often, monsters and giants are serving a hidden political agenda.
So let's circle back to our old friend Goliath for a second. The texts that describe him as 6'9" are centuries older than the ones that pump him up to nearly 10 feet tall. That is a huge red flag that the change was intentional, a later addition. But why? Why do it? Well, the motivation is an absolute masterstroke of political and religious PR. Think about it. By making the enemy bigger, more monstrous, completely impossible to defeat, David's victory is no longer just a clever underdog story. No, it becomes a flat-out miracle, a clear sign of God's favor for him and, by extension, his entire nation. The bigger the monster, the greater the hero. And trust me, this wasn't some one-time trick. The ancient Greeks and Romans were the undisputed masters of using giants as powerful political symbols. It was a way to define who they were, and maybe more importantly, who their enemies were. In Greece, for instance, their whole mythological war against the giants, the Gigantomachy, became a popular stand-in for their very real historical victory over the Persian invaders. It framed their war as civilization versus barbarism, order versus chaos. Then, centuries later, the Romans took similar figures, like the hundred-handed giants, and they completely flipped the script. The giants were no longer a foreign enemy. They became symbols of internal chaos, a threat to the new stable social order that Emperor Augustus had built. It's a timeless political tool, right? Turn your opponent into a monstrous existential threat, and you rally people to your cause. Okay, So we've seen how language and politics can literally build a monster. But some of these stories, they point to something way deeper, to theological and philosophical mysteries that scholars have been arguing about for thousands of years. One of the most fascinating mysteries comes from Genesis 6, with the sons of God who, according to the text, fathered a race of giants called the Nephilim. So who were they? Well, the jury's been out for centuries. One theory says they were just from the righteous human lineage of Seth. Another says they were powerful human kings who basically started acting like gods. And then there's the more controversial fallen angel theory, that they were actual celestial beings who rebelled and came down to Earth. And that idea, that little thread of non-human origins, it pulls us into our final, and maybe the wildest lens yet. What if we're not just looking at myths here? What if some of these ancient stories are describing something that sounds eerily like, well, science fiction? Let's talk about the Rakshasas from ancient Indian texts for a second. The descriptions of them are just wild. They're called engineered hybrids with superhuman abilities. They could regenerate from horrific wounds. They could even enter a state of hibernation, almost like a reptile. And maybe the most fascinating part of all, some people have pointed out that ancient carvings at the Thirumayam temple in India look shockingly similar to the double helix structure of DNA. Is that just a coincidence or a memory of something else? So once you start piecing all this together, the linguistic tricks, the political agendas, the theological debates, even these really speculative ideas, your entire perspective just shifts. You can't look at these creatures as simple fairy tale villains anymore. And that's the real takeaway here, the big secret. Monsters are never just monsters. They are mirrors. They reflect a society's deepest fears, the political ambitions of its leaders, the evolution of its beliefs, and sometimes its most profound and unsettling questions about who we are and where we even came from. Which leaves us with one last question, and this one's for you. We've seen how ancient monsters were a reflection of their times, so take a good look at the villains and the monsters in our own stories today. What do they say about us?